Hi everyone and welcome to the Merlin's Magic Workshop. My name is Jeremy and I'm really happy to welcome you for this third video on how to paint Space Marines in simplified non-metallic metal. In the first video we looked at the blue scheme, typically ultramarines, and then we worked on the green scheme with options to make it look more like Dark Angel scheme or Salamander scheme. The painting process was quite similar for both blue and green because those paints have similar properties. But today we are going for something a little bit different, a little bit more spicy, the Red NMM scheme. Red is considered by many as difficult paint to work with, and I think there are two main reasons for that. The first reason is that red paints, especially for pure tones, are usually translucent paints, so it's a bit more difficult to apply, but mainly the overall aspect will always depend on what color you put beneath the red layer. By the way, this is the same problem with orange and yellow. In general, it's not recommended to apply red on top of a dark base coat, which would desaturate the render and kill the power of the red. Instead, better to use a light color or first do a pre-shading to establish bright spots before applying the red layer. So in the end, we already have good solutions to overcome this first problem, and actually translucency can be a strength, especially to obtain a nice glaze consistency without adding too much water to the paint and lose its mechanical properties. The second issue with reds, and to me this is the most problematic one, is to establish the light tones. I will give you an example to better describe the problem. If I show you this, you will tell me it's blue, and that is a light blue. Same thing with the green, that becomes a light green if I add a little bit of white. But for the red, there is no chance that you would tell me that this is light red, this is pink, even though I just added some white as for the other colors. And that's the problem, our brain will interpret this new color not as a brighter version of red, but as a completely different color. One of the main challenges with miniature painting is to create enough contrast to emphasize the volumes and to break this impression of small scale. So for each color we want to apply in the miniature, we need to establish a scheme with darker and lighter tones. But all these different tones, those different variations should still be associated to the same main color. But we just saw that for red it's complicated to maintain this scheme consistency because light tones are easily interpreted as a different color, so belonging to a different color scheme. I mentioned about the pink effect, but it's the same if we highlight with orange or another light tone. They are not recognized as light red. So the main difficulty for the red is to find the right mix, the right proportions and the right balance between the tones so that the main scheme remains consistent and it is correctly interpreted as pure red. It is sometimes recommended to work more on the dark tones instead of highlights, so to go towards deeper shadows and leave pure red as the brightest tone. So in that case, indeed, we bypass the problem, but it doesn't work very well in the case of non-metallic effect. There, we need to push the contrast even more, going from almost black to almost white. And so we need to find a solution to overcome the light tone problems with the red scheme. And as you guessed, that's the topic of this video. We will see together how to build the red non-metallic effect to obtain this result. Of course, this is not the only way to do it, but this scheme works pretty well and it is in the continuity of what we have done in the previous videos. If you like this kind of tutorials, please like the video, subscribe and share. This gives me the motivation to make more. You can also support the channel by joining me on Patreon with the link just here. And becoming Patreon, you will also have access to a private Discord where we can chat, exchange pictures of our miniatures and share our feedback. You can also follow my work on Instagram with the link that will appear just here. Alright, so I'll leave you with the tutorial and I'll catch you at the end as usual for a final discussion. Enjoy the video and see you later.
Alright, so the philosophy for the color scheme will be a little bit different to what we have done so far. First, we will establish a base with heavy red for the shadows and anti-skin for the light. And we will create a simple transition with the same techniques we used in the previous videos. With that, we will obtain a kind of pre-shading with colors that are close to red but with a better coverage. Then we will shift the scheme closer to the pure red by applying a glaze made of scarlet blood with a touch of orange fire. And after that we will enhance the shadow with a mix of heavy red and evil red, a dark violet. For the highlights we will push up to the pure skin tone from Valero. As for the previous videos, I will first explain the details of the process on the right leg and then I will go more quickly over the rest of the miniature. We start with the base coat, using the nice color heavy red. Then, with a mix of 50% heavy red and 50% anti-skin, I will place the primary reflections. If you want more explanation about the primary reflections and how I place them, please check the previous videos because it's exactly the same concept. But just as a summary, primary reflections mainly define where the main source of light is located. This time again, I'm going for a zenithal configuration, so I'm placing the primary reflections on top of each part of the leg. And in order to have a consistent light for all the elements, I draw a line of light from the top of the leg to the tip of the foot, so that all reflections point us to the same source of light. Those two colors, heavy red and Antea skin, are obviously not pure reds. One is darker with a bit of blue, and the other one is a skin tone, so with a bit of white and yellow. But they have a much better coverage compared to pure red, so it's perfect to quickly establish a base gradation. Then we will work on the highlight, still for the primary reflections, by using Antea skin. So the same place as before, but covering a smaller area. On the other hand, to build up the shadows, I will use a mix of 2/3 heavy red and 1/3 Antea skin, and I go around the regions I painted earlier to define a larger surface. As for the blue and the green schemes I presented before, we start working only with the simple layering techniques, just to establish the color foundation. I apply 2 or 3 thin layers until I get a nice and clean coverage. And we will come back later with other techniques to refine the transitions. This is what I call the staircase gradation process. First, we lock in the light in the coarse but clean way to quickly visualize the global render, and then we smooth out the transitions to obtain a final result. For the next step, we move to the secondary reflections. It's the same process than for primary reflections. We establish the staircase gradation in 4 steps: the dark tone, middle tone, the light tones, and of course the base color that is already on the miniature. With the secondary reflections, we want to simulate the light that comes from the environment of the miniature. So in this case, they are placed inside of the leg and are oriented toward the ground. In previous videos, I was explaining that secondary reflections are in general less intense than primary reflections, because they come from a light that already bounced onto the environment before bouncing again on the metallic armor. And it's still the case here, but for the red scheme, I will paint all reflections with the same light intensity, and later I will attenuate some of the reflections when applying the resaturation glazes. It's just a different approach. And now we can proceed with the blending process. The staircase gradations are in place for all reflections, and so now we can come and blur the transition to get a smooth finish. To create smooth transition, I usually go for the fat glaze technique, which corresponds to a paint consistency between the glaze and the layer. The goal is to pull the paint from one zone to another to blur out the transition. But it's still a semi-transparent consistency, so we need to be careful with the direction in which we pull or push the paint. In general, there is much less pigment left at the beginning of the stroke and much more at the end of the movement when we take off the brush. So if my brush is loaded with the color number 2, for example, better to end the brush stroke in the zone number 2, not to leave any visible marks. The main idea is to pull the pigment by following small diagonals from zone number 1 to zone number 2, having paint number 2 on the brush. Then, with the brush loaded with paint number 1, I pull the pigments to zone number 1, but this time following the opposite diagonal to minimize the creation of visible strokes. And I will repeat the same process 2 or 3 times until the transition line has almost disappeared. Finally, I will apply a standard glaze, so more diluted than for the fat glaze, over the entire transition. First with color 1 to zone number 1, and then with color 2 to zone number 2. I usually start by working on the light tone, because that's what we see at the first sight, and it's useful to monitor the balance of the intermediate tones. In other words, to verify that we have sufficient amount of dark and light tones and a nice progression in between. I take my time to really blur out the transition lines and to eliminate as much as possible all the brush strokes. The glazes we will apply later will also help to hide the imperfection, but the cleaner the base is, the better the result will be. So now we will take care of the tertiary reflection, which are essentially coming from the light emitted by the armor itself, because of the primary and secondary lights already painted on the miniature. And I will use the fat glaze technique with the same parameters I used before. In previous videos, I painted the tertiary reflection at the same time as the primary and secondaries, so using the staircase gradation process before moving to the blending step. But for this scheme, which has only 2 colors, and because the areas to paint are very small, I can do it directly with the fat glaze technique. It also shows that we can easily adjust the painting process and get to the same result. When all reflections are done, I can take care of the lining, doing it in 2 steps. First, with a mix of heavy red and Antia skin, I go over all the edges, regardless their orientation. This is just to redefine the different elements of the leg. Then, with pure Antia skin, I push on the edges oriented towards the top of the miniature. And then we move to a new step that we didn't need for the blue and the green schemes, and I call it the resaturation. Up to now, our color scheme goes from a dark red with a touch of blue to a skin tone. This is good because those paints have a strong coverage, but we end up with the color palette that is not exactly red and it's very desaturated. So now the goal is to use the overlay technique to obtain a rich and well saturated red. Then we will do another layer of lining with brighter color to enhance the definition. Let's simplify the miniature and consider just a sphere, where we have our primary, our secondary and our tertiary reflections. My overlay technique consists of 4 steps. First, we do a partial coverage using a mix of scarlet blood and orange fire, using the very thin glaze consistency. At the moment, we will ignore the primary reflections areas and apply the paint only over the secondary and tertiary reflections as well as on the shadows. After that, we will go for a second time with the same mix and the same consistency, but this time over the entire miniature, including the primary reflections. For step number 3, we will build up the highlights. With a mix of 50% Antia skin and 50% skin tone, and using the fat glaze consistency, I will place tiny spots of light on the primary reflections, and on the edges that are close by. For the last steps, we will improve the shadows. With a mix of 25% heavy red and 75% evil red, I will apply a thin glaze over the dark zones that don't receive much light. There are 2 main advantages when doing the red resaturation in 2 layers. First, it allows to keep control, better to apply multiple thin layers than one big that could destroy the transition we just did before. But also, when doing the first layer, we only cover the secondary and tertiary reflections, and doing that, we slightly reduce their intensity compared to the untouched primary reflections. So it allows to bring back the correct hierarchy of light intensity as we did for the blue and the green schemes, but in a different way. The second layer of red glaze really gives the interesting and powerful look to the color scheme, but it will also attenuate the overall contrast. That's why step 3 and 4, which bring higher light and shadows, are necessary. And with that, the right leg of the Space Marine is now completed. And we will then move to the rest of the miniature. The technique is always the same. First, we establish the simple staircase gradation with the two initial colors, then we smooth out the transition using the fat glaze technique. After that, we will resaturate the color scheme with the 4 steps overlay technique to give back its power to the red tone, retrieve the proper hierarchy of light, and finally improve the overall contrast. For now, it's still a bit difficult to really appreciate the red skin, because the entire miniature was base coated with a dark red, which is still there. So our eyes are quite saturated with red and we cannot properly distinguish all the subtlety of the work we have done so far. But after we paint all other elements with other colors, we will rebalance the miniature and the red armor will pop up almost instantly and will appear much more interesting. The red armor is now finished and we can finally take care of the other textures. We will start with the dark NMM Steel using my usual recipe. For the base I use the heavy charcoal from the extra opaque range of Vallejo. Then I introduce a bit of electric blue to bring the blue tones to the shadows. For the middle tones I add more electric blue. For the highlights I will incorporate more and more white to the previous mix until I get a sort of light bluish grey. Finally, I smooth out all the transitions using the flat glaze technique. I won't show all the details of this part because I did the very same twice in the previous video, so I will put the link in the description in case you want to see more. Then we move to the non-metallic gold. For the base color I use heavy grey. The greenish tint will give a nice old look to the metal. For the shadows I will use heavy brown, which I will highlight with heavy gold brown to give the warm tone. For the highlights I will use pale yellow, which is absolutely fantastic for gold NMM, and then I will mix it with a bit of white for the brightest lights. This gold recipe, in my opinion, works very well with most colors, but with red I think it stands out even more, especially with the touch of green in the shadows, which brings interesting color contrast, subtle but efficient. For what concerns the other elements of decoration, I simply improvise depending on my moods and on what paints I have in front of me. For the court, I choose the same violet I use for the shadows of the armor, and I light it up with more saturated purple and then with white. For the leather, I really did not want to use colors that contains too much red in it, and this is usually the case with the brown paints. So I chose to start with the base of heavy charcoal, a dark grey, which I can extend with a bit of brown, and then push towards the highlight with bone white to bring the saturation down a little bit. And now that all the colors are put together, we can truly appreciate the power of the red scheme.
Alright my friends, so the miniature is now finished. It took me between 11 and 12 hours for this scheme, so it's a little bit long, but let's keep in mind that I do not master at all this color scheme, which I developed just for this video, so I do not have a lot of experience from my side. By the way, something I should have pointed earlier in the previous videos, with a bit of experience and a good plan, you can easily speed up the paint job and reduce the time to just a few hours per miniature. So that makes it interesting if you want to make larger squad or even a small army. On top of that, I also have to paint in a very uncomfortable position for the camera, so I also need more time to basically get to the final result. So that's another parameter to consider. Anyways, I hope you liked the videos. In the end, the red scheme is not that hard to create. We first established the simple base transition, a sort of pre-shading, but using colors from dark red to lighter flesh tones, using techniques that we saw in the previous videos. Then we came back with glazes to tint, or as I said, to resaturate the scheme with a pure and powerful red tone. And finally, we reinforced the shadows and the highlights to push the contrast even further. And so this brings me to the end of this video. Thank you very much for your support and for your super nice and encouraging feedback. I will see you in the next episode where we will tackle the yellow scheme. And in the meantime, I wish you an excellent day. See you next time.